Welcome. This is Peter Karoff, direct from the TPI studios in Boston. That's not exactly accurate, but we're delighted to have you with us today, especially those who are logging on through our webcast or calling in. We're glad you're here. We're delighted you're here. We hope this is going to be a great session. We're also pleased to welcome everyone who is on site in this wonderful Putnam Investments Conference Auditorium. What was that? We're very appreciative of Putnam to have made this high-tech facility available to us. We thank Nancy Fisher, Senior Vice President, and Larry Lasser, Chairman and CEO of Putnam, for making it available. We're also very pleased to have the WGBH Forum filming and recording this seminar. Through the GBH Forum capacity, the program in its entirety will be accessible for 3 years, which will extend the effort and enable others who could not be with us today to benefit from the program. And as a GBH overseer, it's wonderful to see the potential of technology being realized. Lastly, I want to thank John Aberle, whose generous support for this program has gone beyond the financial. His enthusiasm and excitement for the potential of educational conferencing has greatly aided us in the design of this session. To those of you who are off-site, as those and on the webcast, we hope you're going to participate with us by sending in your questions as we go along. And when I open the floor to questions, you're going to have on your screen the ability to access an ability to send in that questions. And also, I want to remind those who are off-site that the survey that'll be an assessment of what has been taken away from this and what you'd like in the way of additional information around this subject will come at the end of the session. We're hopeful you'll fill it out. Over the last 15 years, since 1989, TPI has done a whole variety of educational conferences and programs and workshops and sessions, primarily, I would say, from a process perspective, primarily to try to help people who are trying to get their act together to develop a way of approaching philanthropy that really does work. We've always wanted to go deeper into the issues. We've always felt that that was lacking. There wasn't as much depth in what was available to donors and to foundations. We also wanted to explore technology to see how it works, whether it is in fact effective to join in vis-a-vis web and telephone. And in essence, Tuesdays at TPI is exactly that. That's what we hope to do. In addition to the session today, the transcript of which will be turned into a monograph, we're going to publish a journal that'll, in essence, take not only what's discussed here, but go deeper into the question, maybe bring in perspectives, including perspectives from those who are online with us today. And that journal, we hope, will be an effort to create more dialogue, to encourage and stimulate and clarify what foundations and donors can do in this space. Well, why did we pick public policy, politics, and philanthropy as the first of these sessions? The short answer is that philanthropy is only one player among others, and it is absolutely impossible to ignore the role of government policy, legislation, and regulation in almost any issue that we could be interested in. It is true nationally, and it is true very locally, so it's both. So whether it's school reform, environmental issues, human services, community development, environmental concerns, what government does or doesn't do is a huge factor in the equation of what we as donors or in the nonprofit community can do. It also relates to the tradition of philanthropy in the American experience, the best frame of which that I know lies in the opening lines of Walt Whitman's epic poem, Leaves of Grass. One self I sing, a single separate person, yet out of the words democratic, the words en masse. And in a nutshell, that's it. It's the single separate person, individualistic, entrepreneurial, and yet in ways that are truly unique, some how we're connected to community, we're connected to the nation and to the world. So philanthropy, which is private action in public space, in the whole role of the independent sector, is that of providing another voice. And these spaces are mixing up in ways that are more and more confusing. Lots of examples of what that might be, and those of you online would love to hear what you think could be other examples. Andrew Carnegie's gift of 2,700 public libraries in this country at the turn of the century, the Ford Foundation modeling what became the war on poverty, education reform of all slices funded by philanthropy. The list could go on. Lots and lots of examples. And before we begin, just a little bit of a frame of some assumptions. Our definition of public policy, I think, will become a lot clearer after the comments from our panelists. But we think it's broad and inclusive. We think action, and you'll hear how action is possible from large and small donors. You do not have to be a large donor to do intelligent things in this area. I think we also assume that the resources involved are more than money. The resources involved are access, a reputation, and standing. And also the assumption, our working assumption, is that government cannot do it alone. Another reason we chose this subject is that we know donors hold back. We know private foundations are very unclear and reluctant to get into this area. And it's the reason why the tagline to this little conference is, "How close to the chasm does one dare go?" assumes that there's a line out there somewhere. And where is that line between political action and advocacy? I mean, it is not a simple subject. There's also concern on the part of many donors we have known that you can get into a no good deed goes unpunished situation when you enter this space. You get all kinds of stuff coming at you from the media when you as a private funder are out there. And it can be a rough game. It can be a very rough game. So we know that holds people back. In some ways, we also know from the TPI experience, and this is the 15 years of working with several hundred donors in a whole variety of ways, that a lot of whether or not you can get interested in this as a donor depends upon where you are on what we've come to call the philanthropic curve. And that curve is really a continuum where someone decides to become a donor, then decides to get organized. That is usually the step when one sets up a private foundation or a donor-advised fund at a community foundation or a financial instrument. The next step we have seen, and this is the space where TPI has had the most, I would say, impact or results, is when people decide they really want to become a learner. They want to know more about something. They want to go beyond what they read in the newspaper. And then the last piece of that is they really become focused on what the results are, what the impact, what are they really getting for this kind of situation. And they want to become leveraged. And in the TPI vernacular, that's nirvana. That's our nirvana, when you really have reached that point. And it is in the access, we think, between learning, becoming serious about results, and trying to see where the leverage points are, that a donor begins to really think seriously about the whole issue of public policy and public space. Well, that's enough for a little bit of context. And now to our panel, and why this particular distinguished panel? Well, we knew we wanted to present a range of situations, so it was by design. On the one hand, we have an organization that has an annual operating budget of $300,000 and works very, very focused on a small region of the country, up to something with an organization with several $billion in assets that has designed a whole range of things that are attempting to work in this arena from a national perspective to try to be useful to the citizens of the country. In addition, we wanted a corporate voice, and we were particularly struck that we found one that was quite different, quite unique. and we have that voice. And then lastly, we wanted a voice that was more of a reflector, a thinker, a writer, but someone who also has had very practical experience in helping a mid-sized foundation develop what have been extremely powerful and sharp interventions along a particular way of thinking. So we wanted a mix, and that's what we've got. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the panel. And I'm not going to go through their biographies. They are in your packet, and I believe if all systems are working, they're in front of you on your computer. But to my right is Rodney Berry, who is the president of the Public Life Foundation of Owensboro, Kentucky. And we met Rodney through John Hager, a client of TPI's, the former publisher of the newspaper in that region, who took his private foundation and in essence used those funds to endow an operating foundation, a public charity that does amazing work. An interesting story because Mr. Hager, lifelong resident of an area, deeply committed to issues, knows the place, loves the place, and has gone with a very modest amount of money, relatively speaking, and done some amazing things. We're glad that Rodney is here. He's been involved from a Little League to JC's to Chamber of Commerce level. We're very, very pleased to have Rebecca Reimel here, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Pew Charitable Trust. Pew, as almost everyone knows, is one of the largest charitable foundations in the country. Rebecca has been there for a few years. She has taken what was a very, very, I would say, traditional way of looking at a large philanthropy and turned it into one that is, without a doubt, one of the most thoughtful. And in my view, has come into this question of the public space with more energy and more thought and more results than any other national foundation. We're delighted that Rebecca is with us. Andrew Dreyfus is the president of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts Foundation, set up in 2001 by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts as a separate private foundation, not controlled by Blue Cross, but to work in the whole arena of the uninsured. Andrew comes out of the policy world, was with the Mass Hospital Association for a number of years, and deeply committed personally to these areas as well. So we have an unusual corporate voice. Bill Shambra, who's the director of the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal at the Hudson Institute, who has written widely. When we were in the office, TPI's president, Joe Breiteneicher, indicated he has sent one of Bill's articles out to over 300 people at this point. He spent a number of years, almost 10 years, as the director of programs at the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, a funder that has the moniker of being a conservative foundation. Bill asked me if I knew any other conservatives who could have been on this panel. I told him I knew one other, and that person couldn't come. But we're delighted to have him here, and I apologize for typecasting. It's a weakness of a weak sense of humor. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask each of our panelists to just give an opening statement of 4 or 5, 6 minutes about what has motivated them to enter this world, why they do what they're doing. And then we're going to a series of questions, which we're going to talk about for really an hour and 15, 20 minutes. Too many questions. We're going to see how well we do. And in that part, we will want your involvement and your participation on all levels, both those here in our wonderful room in Boston, as well as those who are off-site. So we'll begin with Rodney Berry. Thank you, Rodney.
Thank you, Peter. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Greetings from Owensboro, Kentucky, a small city perched on a big bend of the Ohio River in western Kentucky. We're a city of about 55,000 people, and the city and county combined of about 90,000. My hometown, and in the last few years I've been fortunate to be part of a rather remarkable philanthropic initiative started by a former newspaper publisher, as Peter mentioned, John Hager. Our organization promotes the democratic process in the Jeffersonian sense. We seek to develop civic capital and the empowerment of ordinary citizens, people from all walks of life, into community affairs, into the mainstream of community affairs or their public life. We do this by embracing and facilitating a three-pronged process for community problem solving. One is information, two is deliberation, and three is action. Let me give you an example. Much of our time and attention and resources in the last few years have been directed to health care. A few years ago, we commissioned a regional health needs assessment conducted by the University of Kentucky. Healthcare access issues emerged as a critical issue in that study. We packaged that information in a way that could be understood by ordinary citizens in the form of a dialogue guide, an issue brief, and then went about the process in a year-and-a-half period of time of convening and conducting 52 community forums on healthcare access issues. We took this to the community. We did not announce perfunctory public hearings and expect people to attend. We took our hearings, our meetings, our discussion groups to schools and community centers and churches and fire stations, anywhere and everywhere that would welcome us. And we wrestled with these issues for 2 hours or 3 hours at a time. And through that process, certain themes emerged, certain community strategies emerged. But perhaps most impressively, from this core group of several hundred, 600 participants in these forums, we had a core group of participants who wanted to stay involved and had formed a healthcare advocacy group to work on the local level for these issues on an ongoing basis. So we helped them organize. We provided consultation. We provide administrative and financial support for this organization that now, nearly 2 years later, has 90-plus members, have had several hundred people attend their monthly meetings. They have regular speakers. They take positions. They issue position papers. They ask tough questions. They have credibility and visibility in our community. Their meetings are broadcast on the local cable TV access channel, and we continue to provide administrative and financial support for that organization. We're also involved in education and community appearance and design, in children's issues, in race and ethnic relations in our community. A number of interest and programs and projects represent the scope of our work. But that process of information, deliberation, and action, I think, is what demonstrates how a local foundation with modest resources can, I think, be involved in the mainstream of public policy on our level.
Thank you, Rodney. Just out of curiosity, how large a community is Owensboro?
55,000, city and county combined of about 90,000. And we have a staff of 3 full-time people and 1 part-time person.
And what would you estimate the number of people you've reached that have participated in all these various?
Thousands and thousands. Healthcare alone, I would say several thousand, but probably in the tens of thousands. Yeah.
Rebecca Reimel.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me today. Philanthropy is a big tent, and it is its diversity that is the strength. So as I talk about the work of the Pew Charitable Trust, I do so in a way to inform you, but not to suggest that our approach is necessarily the right way, and certainly not the only way. Donors often leave us instructions, but it really is up to the current board to carry out the stewardship responsibility that they have inherited. If you look at philanthropy as a continuum, you might think of it as the traditional philanthropy on the one end. On the other end, perhaps a more active, entrepreneurial, and some might argue, aggressive approach to problem solving. I think my first piece of advice was to know where you want to go. If you don't, any road will take you there. I remember it was about 10 years ago now, and yes, I've been at the foundation forever. And I was doing one of these visioning things with my board, and they were looking there and at me politely, and then I started to see them kind of nod off, and I thought, oh, I'm sunk here, because we were getting nowhere. And I said, okay, let's just cut through it. It's 5 years from now, and you're on an airplane, and two people are sitting behind you, and they're talking about the Pew Charitable Trust. What are they saying that just makes you pump with pride or slouch with shame? Because if you can answer that question, then we can figure out where we're going. And to a person, they answered it the same in their own way. We want to work on a couple of issues that matter a lot to the health and happiness of the American public, and we want to move the needle on those issues. We want to be relevant, and we want to push for change that's in the public interest. We don't want to fund a lot of studies that prop up credenzas. We don't want to have a lot of convenings with people that already know what they think before they get there, and then on they went in very colorful language. Well, I said, if that's the case, we're going to have to change everything about this institution. First of all, that means we are going to be working in the policy arena. It means we need to recruit staff that understand how public policy happens, both at the state and the federal level, that understand and have disciplinary depth on the issues in which they work. Secondly, we're going to have to create an internal infrastructure to support policy work. Yes, a legal team. Yes, a public affairs and media team. And a lot of other enhancements to the way that we are structured. Secondly, we're going to have to approach our work totally differently. First of all, you're going to need to know what your investments are targeted to do. We're going to have to give you annual benchmarks. And in 5 to 10 years, we're going to have to be able to win at the topics we picked to work on. First of all, you need to know what the risk is, and you need to know what the reward is. I guarantee you, you will have less people being nice to you at cocktail parties, and you will have a lot more controversy in your life. But if you're up for the ride, so am I. In fact, then we changed the foundation. We do work on a range of policy issues, but we also go about our work very differently. Anytime we choose a new area in which to get involved, the design work takes approximately a year. And as one of my board members reminds me, please don't fall in love with love, which is his way of saying make sure you can walk away at every point in time unless you're sure that we have better than a 50-50 chance of winning. And what does winning mean? Winning means getting additional congressional appropriation for certain things. It means getting administrative action on certain issues. And yes, it means getting legislation enacted on issues on which we care about. We have a very different internal staff now. As I said, we've had to build up our media relations, and that's interesting given that we're a foundation where our donors for 40 years told us that they wanted us to do everything anonymously. And I should have begun my presentation by saying I have a board that sits for life terms, and 3/4 of them are members of the Pew family. So I often get the question, well, gee, what would your donors do if they knew? And I say, well, I've got the next best thing. I've got all their kids sitting around the board table. And they take their stewardship responsibility very seriously. I guess my second point is know what your strengths are and know what your limitations are. When the media covers philanthropy, it's all about size. It seems that size is all that matters. But I agree with your comment. It's not about that. It's about being highly focused, very committed, having tenacity to stay with it, actually leading with your head instead of your heart, being fearless in your approach, and unapologetic in the face of criticism. And that is if the criticism is not about the way you're approaching your work, but it is about the ideas and ideals that you're pursuing. Just quickly, we put our work in 2 big clusters at the national level. The first is informing the public about issues that are going to matter to their health and well-being. And secondly, advocating policy solutions. Under our information work, we choose issues that are not yet ripe or issues where we believe that bringing air and light and more information will help policymakers, the press, and the public. 6 years ago, started a project on Internet and American life. It's changing absolutely everything we do, including how we're having this conference. Hispanics in America, started that 8 years ago. And now today we understand what an important force Hispanics are going to be in shaping our country. We have the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press that polls on politics and a range of other issues. And I have a partner here that helped us start a global attitude survey, which told us how little we know about the rest of the world and what the world really thinks about us. When the facts are clear, we do move from, if you will, the honest broker role to the advocate role. And we do that in a way that to help the people's voice be heard. Some of the issues on which we work: campaign finance reform, pushing the alcohol industry to stop marketing to our youth, helping our government understand that we need a better oceans policy in this country, or one at all. We work on global warming as well. We're pushing for more regulation on genetically modified foods, and we're trying to actually help all of us understand where reproductive genetics is going to take us and how we need to regulate its use. In fact, I would say that public policy work is not for all. You need to be optimistic, you need to be a bit skeptical, and you certainly need to have a thick skin. But we believe that it is one way that we can best use our resources to serve the public interest.
Rebecca, do you, when you think of other large foundations that are doing important work in this area, do you wonder why there aren't more?
Well, I'm quick to say that foundations approach their work in different ways, and that diversity is a good thing. I do believe that we are awfully shy and timid in our approach, and I do wonder why. If you think about it, we don't have shareholders to serve. We don't have constituents that we have to worry about for fundraising purposes. If ever there were institutions in America that should stand up and be counted, it's a foundation. And as long as your board is with you, I can't sort of understand why we would necessarily turn our back and walk away.
Interesting. I would like to now ask Andrew Dreyfus to comment.
Thank you, Peter. As Peter mentioned, the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts Foundation was created 2.5 years ago by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. And at the time when it was announced, it was stated to be a contemporary expression of the historic commitment of the company. I'd like to explain that for just a second. When you think back to the 1930s and 40s, when Blue Cross and other health insurance companies were formed in this country, they were formed not to take care of wealthy people who at the time were still usually being cared for by private physicians, often in their own homes. It was really to care for middle class and low income people who had no safety net and for whom hospital care was their only choice and for which there was at the time no reimbursement. And so the birth of these companies really came from a philanthropic motive. But times have changed, and health insurance companies now have to respond to a variety of market-based directives. But in this case, the company still held those values that reach back to its origins. And it wanted to make a very clear public statement that those values still mattered. And so it created a new charitable foundation, independent and run separately from the company. There are 17 board members, only 3 of whom come from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. They put on this board some of the leading health policy and health advocates in the state, and gave it a single charge. And so, as Rebecca said, focus is important. Well, we have a very clear focus. Is actually the same focus that the group in Kentucky decided to look at, which was health access for those who were without insurance and low-income people who face barriers to care. And I would say that that constitutes still perhaps our national shame, that we have more than 40 million Americans and more than 500,000 people in this state who every day wake up without the security of health insurance. So if that was our issue, what to do about it? Well, we knew to advance this issue required not only grant making, which we do and I'll discuss in a moment, but also a very active role in the public policy space, because to really advance this issue of the uninsured, which has been something that has been nagging our political leadership at a national and a state level, certainly since the days when Harry Truman and later Richard Nixon proposed some form of national health insurance. And today, as we see in the presidential campaign, the emerging presidential campaign and the debates in Washington around prescription drugs, the gaps in our health insurance system are still at the top of the national agenda, and regular polling tells us it's at the top of the public's agenda. So faced with that problem, we decided to both invest in the community and so provide grants in a way that illuminated public policy issues and then very actively take a role in public policy. And we do that in 4 key ways. First, we fund the leading organizations in Massachusetts that are trying, as you did in Kentucky, to get citizens more involved in the public policy process. And so we have a particular grant program that funds the leading health advocacy organizations in Massachusetts. Second of all, we do try to broaden the public debate through studies and leadership forums and try to make them relevant and be cautious, as Rebecca cautioned us, not to convene events that already everyone knows the answer to. Third, we educate journalists through a first-in-the-nation kind of journalism fellowship program where Massachusetts journalists and starting next year, New England journalists, health and medical reporters are come to and spend a 10-day intensive program learning more about health and medicine, but particularly about issues facing the uninsured, and then are mentored throughout the year by the director of that program, who is a seasoned health journalist. And finally, we try to seek synergy between our grants and our public policy activities and try to involve public leaders in that. I know we're going to talk more formally about lessons learned, but I will just mention a few. The first is, I think to be effective in this space, in this public policy space, you have to anticipate tomorrow's agenda. So if you're considering investing in public policy, you ought to be thinking about what Congress or your state legislature is doing next year, because that's where you have to start commissioning your studies if you want them to be relevant and have an impact. Second, I think it's important to try to maximize philanthropic neutrality. My experience is that legislators and policymakers and government leaders are very used to, but sometimes very tired of hearing from labor and business and advocates and providers, for example, in the healthcare community, and welcome a voice at the table that doesn't have a specific agenda other than to educate and to try to advance the debate. Third, I think that true policy change, at least in an area that we're working in, such as low-income health, requires an institutional voice for the disenfranchised. We are fortunate in Massachusetts to have some very progressive funders who had accomplished that by funding an organization that is called Healthcare for All in Massachusetts. They've been working for over a decade on these health access issues, but I believe that to truly represent and advance these issues, you need that institutional voice. As Rebecca said, if you're going to do public policy from a philanthropic position, you have to think differently about how you're staffed, how you administer yourself, how you evaluate your programs, and how you use technology. Good staff who understand public policy may be very different than people who understand how to make grants and work with community groups. And public policy expertise is something that we look for in our staff. Second, evaluating investments in public policy is different than evaluating investments in traditional grants or community programs. It's harder to count, it's harder to show outcomes, it's harder to show successes. And finally, public policy is, although I'll be interested to hear the lessons that Pew may have learned from their experience on the web, this is still a business that operates very much in political spaces, which are very human spaces, and which are often very one-on-one kind of spaces. And so the kind of applications of technology that have worked so successfully in other spheres don't apply so easily into the political world. And finally, I would say that policy is a long-term commitment, that it's not the kind of thing you can get in and out of quickly, because results are not often apparent quickly. It takes time, it takes patience, and boards have to understand that before you go into it.
Andrew, just for clarification, what was the reasoning of Blue Cross Blue Shield to set this up separately as opposed to simply funding a corporate foundation to do the same?
Well, I should say, first of all, that Blue Cross held on. Blue Cross has a substantial corporate contributions program, which still maintains several $1 million a year in local funding. They understood, I think, that to have credibility and to truly advance this issue of access to care for low-income people, that the foundation had to have an independent identity, and it had to be seen as someone who could act and speak with a voice that was independent from the company. And I think to no one's surprise, given that mandate, some of our early grants were to organizations that in fact had sued the company as recently in the last few years. Not that we gave grants to them to make a point, but those were organizations that were working actively in this area. And I should say that I didn't hear a word about it from any member of the company. There was a real investment in the idea that philanthropy in the area of public policy and the area of health access could make a difference.
So probably none of those directors are on our webcast right now trying to hear what else you're saying.
No, I welcome them. So.
Okay, thank you. Bill Shambra.
Well, it is a pleasure for me to be here as well. I think you'll see that the bullets I submitted tend to be a bit more autobiographical. Maybe I got the assignment wrong, but since your experience is probably like Peter's, you don't know too many conservative philanthropists, and so it may require some explanation how one can combine those two things. I entered the realm of public policy in the mid-'70s as a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And I need to footnote that for a second. If you were a conservative graduate student in the 60s or 70s, you were not welcome in the universities, and you were not welcome in the mainstream think tanks. And the 70s was, in fact, a time when conservatives very self-consciously constructed what really was an alternative intellectual framework for public policy. And the fact that, as I say, if you were a graduate student at that time looking for a job, you were not going to find one in the university is worth noting. But the conservatism I found at AEI was not the stereotypical conservatism of the free market. This happened to be the time when Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse were working on a book called To Empower People. And the point of this little monograph was that the two ideologies in America had come at public policy either from the standpoint of the state or from the individual. And public policy was diminished if you simply understood it in that way. Liberals obviously understood public policy primarily as the creature of the state. Conservatives primarily focused on the market and individuals. But Berger and Newhouse were the first to suggest that there's this whole other level of agency in America, so-called mediating structures, that also have always played a very important role in public policy, but all too often neglected by both liberalism and conservatism. Mediating structures being just a kind of a clunky sociological term for neighborhoods, community associations, places of worship, schools, ethnic groups. In this intermediate layer of life, people were able to step forward and tackle their own problems, solve their own problems. Is this a conservative doctrine? Not really. I've run across many folks in the community organizing community who are very much inspired by the Berger-Newhouse model. And I spent some time after AEI sort of helping in a very minor way, helping the Reagan and the first Bush administrations try to digest this notion, try to create a different kind of conservatism that had some sense of mediating structures. In the case of President Reagan, of course, you had the Private Sector Initiatives Task Force. In the case of President Bush I, you had the 1,000 Points of Light Initiative. All of these were attempts, albeit crude and probably finally unsuccessful, to reflect this new notion of mediating structures. When I went to the Bradley Foundation in 1992, I discovered that there actually were mediating structures alive and well in the neighborhoods of America, and that, although I went there thinking that my primary interest would be in funding public policy, what really caught my interest was getting out of the headquarters and getting into the neighborhoods and actually seeing these neighborhood groups beginning to take back their own lives. This was a period of time when Milwaukee was undergoing the introduction of school choice or parental choice in education, or the destruction of public education, however you want to characterize it. And neighborhoods were in fact beginning to understand what it was to be able to have ownership of their own schools again. One of the figures that I will carry with me for my entire life is that of Mrs. Cordelia Taylor, who established a community-based residential facility for seniors in her home in the inner city of Milwaukee on 11th Street, a very tough neighborhood. She was just tired of seeing the way no-income and low-income elderly were treated in the big institutions, and she stepped forward to solve that problem herself. The Bradley Foundation was very much taken with that effort. Most foundations were not. She's had a very tough time attracting foundation support, and that raised a lot of questions for me about what was going on with foundations and public policy. And slowly I began to realize that most of the large foundations, frankly, are more interested in developing their own programs based on the latest social science expertise and sort of landing them on people rather than really paying attention to what's going on in the neighborhoods and supporting the efforts of groups that are actually doing good things already on the ground. Public policy as practiced by foundations can be profoundly disempowering of everyday citizens trying to solve their own problem. And one of the things we're doing at the Bradley Center is trying to figure, at the Hudson Institute, is trying to figure out why that's so. And it's a long and involved history, but it goes back to the origins of modern foundations. It goes back to some of the largest foundations at the turn of the century, and their very explicit understanding that what they were doing was substituting expert judgment for the judgment of people in the grassroots. That's what this was all about. The Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie, Russell Sage Foundation, a number of the large foundations were very explicitly engaged in the development of a scientific philanthropy that was designed to shove aside the grassroots neighborhood indigenous efforts that were all too often, in their understanding, based on parochial concerns like faith and ethnic and ideological visions. So that's what I'm up to. I say sorry to Peter Goldmark, formerly of the Rockefeller Foundation, because he and I have had this conversation before, and I know he has a very different understanding of what Rockefeller was up to, but that's my reading.
You have so beautifully, Bill, introduced our first question, and which is for the panel and for all of you here and all of you out there. What is the appropriate and best role for philanthropy in the public policy space? How does philanthropy define its job? What gives a foundation the right to do public policy work? And how do the roles of the media and the private sector interrelate with the public sector? Panel?
Could I begin by taking issue with the last point,
We
which really addresses the
promised
question?
everyone this was not going to be a boring panel. Therefore, taking issue is absolutely right.
I can't think of any more important way to give voice to all of those people in communities than in working in the policy arena. I'll take one example. The hundreds of thousands, millions of people that wrote to their elected leaders to say that they didn't want their public lands, and particularly their old-growth forests, sold to corporate interests. Hundreds of thousands of people educated about this issue. They have a stake in those public lands, and they've lifted their voices and exercised that right to inform the policymakers. They wouldn't have had either the knowledge or the opportunity, but that a grassroots campaign was developed that was geared toward informing public policy. So I wouldn't want the audience to have a sense that you can do public policy without the public. And the public is made up of people living in all those communities that you described. So whatever the issue might be on which a foundation elects to work, if they're going to win at it and win with the people that they are there to serve and act in the public interest, they've got to have the public behind them.
And how does that then tie into your own sense of the definition of how philanthropy should operate? Or did you just, in fact, say it?
Well, I believe, I think I sort of half said it perhaps. One has to choose issues on which to work that are ripe. We can tilt at windmills all day. If the public hasn't decided or begun to decide that an issue matters to them, it's never going to be ripe enough for us to move the needle on addressing that public policy issue. So ripeness is important, leverage is important, and clearly if public sentiment and public opinion is against a foundation, be it small or large, we might as well forget it. So I like to think of our investment in public policy as giving the public a voice, not special interest always, but the public. And so our polling work attempts to give the public a voice, and our policy work attempts to give the public a voice. But I'm not sure, am I getting to the heart of your question?
Yes, you are. Rodney, Andrew?
Well, if we hope to build a new effective community that's working in advocacy, we need to develop a new generation of advocates. And I think we do that through information, but we also do that through deliberation, through really engaging people so that their voice is heard and they have an opportunity to wrestle with the complexity of issues, the trade-offs, the costs, the consequences, the challenges, all toward an effort to find common ground with people from different perspectives. I think that can happen most effectively at the local level, but I suspect it could happen also at the state and national level to some extent. But one of the things that we learned from our experience that is so gratifying is how advocates can emerge from circumstances to lead an effort. People that you wouldn't think are educated enough or skilled enough to lead a community initiative, if given the right circumstances, if provided with the right kind of information, they can be empowered and they can overcome any shortcomings that they might have. I think there's a reason for foundations to be involved in advocacy work and public policy because we can look at the big picture and we can steer these advocates toward these needs that I agree need to come from them. I think we're uniquely positioned to do that.
I'd like to talk about the role of government for a second because I think it's so important, and although I'll confine my comments to healthcare, I think many of them would be applicable to the environmental field or certainly public education. In healthcare, government actually covers about half the people in our country through Medicare and Medicaid program, and so it is a central actor in the healthcare debate. And so if a philanthropy is charged or takes upon itself a mission for change, and I think change is probably common to all our comments, then to ignore government is to ignore a critical part of the system. And so we take as part of our mission at the foundation to influence larger public and private activities. Rebecca used the word leverage, and I think it's a common word in philanthropy, but what do we really mean by leverage? For example, in Massachusetts, we have a Medicaid program that provides care to almost 1 million people. 1 out of every 4 children in the state spends about $6 billion a year. We as a foundation spend about $4 million a year. That is a drop in the bucket compared to government spending. And so if we don't think about our work as influencing government spending in healthcare, then I think we're not going to make a difference. And in our case, we decided just recently to establish a separate policy institute just focused on the state's Medicaid program. There are probably only about 50 people in the state who can speak intelligently for more than a paragraph about the state Medicaid program, yet it covers a quarter of our children. It covers many of our seniors in nursing homes. It covers almost half the people with HIV in the state. And so here's this very important public program that kind of escapes public scrutiny. And in every state in the country is becoming central to state budget problems. And so that's an example of a role a foundation can play to try to influence a public debate involving a government program. And so to step back from public policy would be to step back from the public sector, and the public sector in healthcare just plays too central a role to do that.
So when you think about the definition of philanthropy in this arena, you view it from that perspective. Does it sound different to you, Andrew, than the way Bill expressed it, or Rebecca, or Rodney?
A little bit. I certainly, and the foundation spends 3/4 of its money investing both in the community with organizations that are doing the kind of work that Bill described in Milwaukee, and with advocacy organizations and public policy groups that both Rodney and Rebecca referred to. But I'd say that I believe you could certainly do good work by investing solely in the community from a grant-making perspective, but I doubt in healthcare you could bring about change solely by doing that. So I think for us it is an imperative to work in the public policy arena because the foundation is geared towards change.
So is the difference, if there is a difference between entering advocacy, is that to you, Bill, for example, not where you would go?
Oh, I think a lot of our groups, I think that the distinction between, at the neighborhood level in particular, the distinction between advocacy and meeting immediate needs of residents is really an artificial distinction. If Mrs. Taylor needs to go down to the police station to agitate for the presence of police on her street, she'll do it, and that makes her, quote, an activist. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think that when found, it's interesting in the period, the past 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of attention to this notion of the decline of civic participation. I know that Pew is very interested in this question. There's been a lot of focus on the work of Robert Putnam and his rather depressing statistics about the degree to which people are becoming less and less involved in public policy. Foundations, I think, have an incredible ability to bring citizens in, and I would agree strongly with the work of the Pew charitable trusts in this regard. I think that foundations do have the capacity to bring citizens in. But if a citizen feels that it's impossible to simply to approach and get a grant from a foundation to do what he or she thinks is best for this neighborhood, then there's a discrepancy between what's going on in terms of what a foundation says it wants and what the citizens say they want. And I guess my point is that foundations come at citizens and are perfectly willing to amplify and empower their voices on certain issues that the foundations have decided are the important issues to be heard. And yet, when Mrs. Taylor comes to us and says, "Look, I need some help with this clinic, and I understand that you think that it's not a new idea and it's not innovative and it's not a startup and it's not all of the things you foundations want to see. Nonetheless, this is what I would like to do." The answer is always no to her. The answer is always, "I'm sorry, that doesn't fit our guidelines." And if foundations take that posture toward everyday citizens trying to step forward to solve their own problems, then the notion of engaging citizens in public policy is just a hollow phrase. It's just
interesting because you're focusing on process here a bit, but I'm so drawn to the notion of several thousand citizens of Owensboro, Kentucky, over a 2-year period getting together in small groups and talking about things. It's extremely interesting. Questions on this subject? How do we define philanthropy doing its job? And we'd like those off-site to enter, if you will. We have some microphones here for anyone in the audience for a couple of questions. We'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions and let the panel respond. My goodness, there's one over there. And identify yourself, please, when you take the mic.
Thank you. My name is Alan McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And I'm just curious, Bill, just picking up where you just left off, if we have a foundation helping the lady to take care of the elderly in her neighborhood, and that goes on for a few years, and then the foundation stops that particular effort and redirects its effort somewhere else, where does that leave the lady who's trying to take care of her neighbors in the neighborhood? Have we started a program that can't be continued? That's my worry.
Well, actually, that's an interesting. That goes to another question that about how does one sort of make grants in this area. Foundations typically have this 3 or 4 or 5 year limit on their grants, and then you're out. Now, where is that rule written down? Foundations typically operate according to the rule that, gee, we're in for the startup. We want to get this new and innovative program started, but then you'll go out and find funding on your own, and you'll get, well, as you say, where is she going to go at the end of 3 to 5 years? Where is the foundation that's established to pick up programs that were started by some other foundation? It is an operating principle of foundations that makes absolutely no sense. And if I were in charge of the foundation with Mrs. Taylor's grant, I would say, as long as she's doing terrific work in the city, keep supporting her. There's absolutely no reason to cut it off at 3 to 5 years.
Any other comment, Rebecca?
I just like to, let me use an example from our environmental work. We were investing a certain amount of money in buying land to protect that land. And, the land was put aside, and that was a good thing. But we were, not making many inroads, because if you looked at what was happening to much of the land in this country, we were going to be on the short end of that stick. The ability to work and make sure that our public lands are preserved for the purposes they were intended, that there's not clear cutting of the national forest, that wilderness areas are protected, that we don't open our national parks and our national wilderness areas to extractive use unless it's a matter of national security. You look at the millions of acres, if you can get that kind of legislation enacted, that kind of policy enacted on behalf of the American public, and the millions of acres that will be saved for our children and our grandchildren. So both are a good thing. The question is, you as the investor have to make a decision. Do I want to focus on making sure that Mrs. Whatever has the clinic? That's a very important thing to do. Or focus on getting the policy changed so that more resources are made available in the community for the disenfranchised. They're both good. They shouldn't be pitted as one is good and one is bad. It's how you see your role and where you see your core competencies and how you see that you can best steward your resources.
Question here. We have a microphone.
I'm going to, before I ask my
Identify
question,
yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Peter Goldmark, and I work for the Environmental Defense Organization. I think that makes me an environmentalist. First, I want to respond to a couple of things Bill Schomburg said briefly, and then I want to ask 2 questions of the panelists. One is a question you asked in the beginning that they haven't addressed, and the second is a provocative one. But first of all, Bill, I think you're caricaturing the situation. There's no rule written down that you can't fund the same thing forever, and there's no rule written down you can't fund something else if what you funded didn't work or didn't result in a change in the system. And I think the caricature of the big, mean, interdirected foundation and the poor, starving community group is pretty far from the reality of most foundations in this country. I also want to challenge the top-down monster you created, who has its own agenda, and on the unknowing and unfeeling people, suddenly that agenda descends on them. Now, sometimes there is such a thing as scientific philanthropy, to create a vaccine where government or the private sector didn't or wouldn't. Maybe that's scientific philanthropy, but sometimes it's a hell of an important thing. For a foundation to fight, as mine did for many years, against forced abortion and controlled family planning in China, to try and introduce voluntary family planning, to try and make contraceptives available to women, poor women around the world who wanted them, very often in the face of the opposition of right-wing foundations and think tanks who said, no, those women don't have a right to choose for themselves. I'm resisting the caricature you're painting. That doesn't advance us. Now, my 2 questions for the panel. Number 1, Peter asked, where's the line between what's appropriate foundation? When are you over that line into the political flames? And when you're on the right side of the line? None of you 4 told us where the line is. Now, this is a tough question, and it bedeviled me when I ran a foundation. But members of the panel, so far, you are batting 0 for 4 on telling us where the line is. Now, the second question is, I come back from a job 5 years overseas, and I'm told that big money is running the country. Big money has access to politicians and influences government policy. Well, foundations are big money. Are foundations influencing government policy? Is big money from foundations dictating our national agenda?
Well, actually, Peter, I hadn't yet addressed that question. I'm so glad you brought it up because it's the next question,
Well,
which really is around, is there a chasm? I mean, is there a line? What are those lines? And I'd like to address the panel in that regard. I can see some energy building that there might be some other things people want to say. You can't control a panel like this, but go.
there is no line. That's the reason there's no answer to the question. It depends. I mean, obviously there are legal lines, and we all know what they are, but, you know, everybody gets good legal counsel, and you're not going to have a foot fault, and you know what you can do and you can't do. This notion that we're all scared to death that we can't, you know, get too close to lobbying or, you know, pushing for, you know, certain pieces of legislation, there is a bright line, and we all know what it is, and, you know, but the line in terms of how far you can and should go to push an agenda in the public interest, I would say there is no line. You know, there is no line. I don't see.
Do you see big risks?
Of course, they're huge risk. I mean, enormous risk. And that's why I would say that, you know, first of all, there's a need to know no surprises. You shouldn't be in this work at any point on the line unless your board is fully involved, fully engaged, fully aware of what the risks are, and understands it's not only a reputational risk, it's a risk of failure. There are a lot of risk involved here, but they're enormous rewards. If you care passionately about providing health care to the uninsured, it would be a home run like no other to get state and federal policy changed such that there was access to even 25% of the 25% of the kids that don't have it. I mean, that would be an enormous contribution that I don't think anyone here would argue would basically be a societal good. So I don't see a line. I mean, I don't see either. There are certainly some technical lines, but I think you should be clear and transparent about your agenda. We shouldn't be ashamed or we shouldn't be apologetic for it, and we should be very clear about what it is we're trying to achieve and why.
Andrew, Rodney?
Well, I would just say that there is a different chasm that does exist between people and policymakers, and I think we see it play out every day. And let's give you an example in healthcare. The public nationally and in the state says repeatedly in poll after poll, no matter how the question is asked, that they believe every person in the country has a right or ought to get health care when they need it, and that ought to include health insurance, health coverage. But that is not translated into public policy, and there are those who say that we'll never have health care reform until we have political finance reform, so I'm glad that some foundations are working on the political finance issue. But I think it's not simply a political issue. This is a tough issue to figure out. It is complicated. It is not easy. And to go on the one hand from the values that we know that people hold from focus groups and from polls and from other instruments that we can use to measure how the public is thinking to policymakers is difficult. And I think philanthropy can play an important translator role there, back and forth, both from policymakers to the public and to the public back to policymakers. So I think a role as a translator or interpreter is one important one.
Rodney?
I would like to address your comment about the top-down monster. I think that many visionary leaders have the best of intent in proposing initiatives, but at least at the local level, the top-down process is not the way to go from our experience. It works sometimes, and ultimately leaders can be saluted for their thick-skinned initiative in accomplishing this or that program or project, but it's so much better to bring the people into the process and to share options and various points of view so that you can cultivate a public. You can you can bring together a critical mass of students and community members who will endorse an initiative and support it through the process of development. That can be applied. I can think of a half a dozen examples in our community where that would have been much more effective than the top-down process. How that relates to state and national initiatives and advocacy work, I'm not sure, but I certainly think we need to be mindful of that.
I don't get one thing, panel. Help me with this question. What is the difference between advocacy, supporting an advocacy organization, and political lobbying? What's the difference? What's the substantive difference?
Well, it's less a substantive difference as much as a legal difference. And when it comes to actually conversations with individual legislators about specific bills, that is something that is prohibited for private foundations to engage in. We are not prohibited, however, and in fact the line is much further along than most, I think, philanthropies believe it is, from supporting the public policy work of an organization whose work will result in direct lobbying and in change in laws. And just to take a step further, although there is a prohibition on the activities of individual philanthropies in the legislative sphere, there are no prohibitions in the regulatory sphere, which people often don't realize.
Right.
I could, if should I decide to do,
As a private foundation.
as a private foundation, testify on regulations, on the rulemaking process in a regulatory agency. I would say, and I might differ with Rebecca on one thing when you say, where's the line and can you cross it? It may be that if you prize your neutrality, and if your neutrality itself allows you to act in a certain way in the public policy arena that allows you to bring about change, then there is a perception that can develop about a particular philanthropy that you may not want because it may reduce or kind of subvert your larger agenda. And I think that's a judgment call.
That's a strategic.
It's a judgment call that one makes almost every day. Every time you talk to a reporter, if you choose to talk to reporters, every time you talk to an elected official, you're making a judgment call about their perception of your organization. And if you value and want to play this role as a neutral convener, you may not, and you don't need to do that, but we've chosen to do that. And so there is a line that we won't cross there.
Just a quick example from our work in campaign finance reform. 10 years ago, we did a lot of work to ask people why they weren't voting. And among other things, they basically didn't feel it was one person, one vote, and they didn't think their vote counted, because they basically believed that politics was in the hands of special interests and big money. And that really led us to our conclusion that if that was really strongly felt among the American public, we had to do something on the campaign finance system. So for roughly 8 years, we funded a whole range of grantees that collected data on every aspect of the flow of money and unregulated money in campaigns both at the state and federal level. When the McCain-Feingold legislation hit the floor, and we pushed hard with the advocacy groups. Initially, the advocacy groups wanted full public financing. That wasn't going to happen, and so getting them to sort of focus on the soft money issue and issue advocacy, other things. Anyway, to make a long story short, when this went to both the House and the Senate, all of the research that had been compiled by the then 8 grantees was used on the floor of the House and the Senate. Subsequently, when the lower court looked at the legislation, they looked at the data, and that was one of the reasons that they decided to give a more favorable ruling than they might have. We provided the support to mount the legal team to fight this in the Supreme Court to see that the legislation wasn't gutted or overturned. It's anybody's guess as to how it's going to come out, but that kind of approach and using every arrow in your quiver on behalf of public policy, just as you were saying, there was nothing that we did there. I mean, we took a lot of flack for it, but there was nothing we did there that even came close to approaching the legal line that we're talking about.
It's interesting how you're framing it this way, both you and Andrew, when we know so many newer private foundations don't think you can do that kind of thing. From your perspective, have you hit lines, Rodney, that you felt you couldn't cross?
We've chosen not to cross. We've chosen to be the neutral convener. Let me give you an example. At one of our healthcare advocacy meetings a few months ago, the issue of a state tobacco tax was raised. Kentucky has one of the highest smoking rates in the country and one of the lowest tax rates, and there was a proposal floating about to increase the tax. It seemed like kind of a no-brainer to us, but we did convene a panel, including a Burley tobacco farmer and a representative of the Farm Bureau, as well as advocates for the tax, and we wrestled with that issue for a couple of hours, prepared a summary, sent out the action alert to all of our members, all those on our database, and encouraged them to come to their own conclusions and contact our local area legislators. We probably could have been much stronger in that regard, but that's the approach that we're taking. Generally, if you trust in the judgment of the people, if you present information on all sides of issues, they'll choose wisely.
Well, in this room, we can say one of Tip O'Neill's famous lines: "Never underestimate the intelligence of the average American voter."
You got it. Oh, it didn't go anywhere. The tax, we're still 3%, I think, still one of the lowest in the country.
Just
Bill.
And I think I'm just echoing what the other panelists have said. If you have to come anywhere close to what is in fact that legal, and it is quite well defined, and it is quite generous. If you have to come anywhere close to that, I would say that alone is failure. I mean, if you can't involve yourself in public policy way far away from the bright line of lobbying, then you're not you're not doing the job correctly. In order to make parental choice in education a reality in Milwaukee, we did a range of things, including the research, including the funding of groups that were working on its behalf, including funding the schools that were for a long time struggling to finance, the private schools that were struggling to finance themselves, and of course then extending to financing the defense against the lawsuits that have been piling up for years and years until finally we have a Supreme Court resolution. All of that happened a very great distance from this line of lobbying. That said, though, I think there is this other question. Lest we think that we can sort of play in the fields of public policy without some concern, we have no right to do these things. We are creatures of legislation. There is no constitutional provision that ensures the presence of foundations. Congress can legislate freely about the longevity of foundations, about their permanence, and indeed, if foundations begin to behave with some arrogance, whatever the sign of that arrogance is, and one of the traditional ways, of course, foundations have been perceived as arrogant, is to approach Congress. You guys are fine, but you're lowly politicians, and you have to answer to your constituents back home. But here is the objective evidence that we have compiled as scientists, and we're here to tell you the facts. You guys can. Well, Congress hears that, and from time to time, takes offense, shall we say, and indeed, not too long ago, took offense and almost incorporated a measure in the Charitable Giving Act of 2003 that would have increased payout, according to the Council on Foundations, to ruinous proportions. I doubt if that's true, but one does have to bear in mind that Congress is hovering over this area.
Questions? A question up in the back row there. Please identify yourself.
My name is Bill Townsend. I'm retired from almost everything.
It has nothing to do but come to intriguing sessions like this. We're so glad you're here, Bill.
Filling my afternoon. Peter, I thank you for putting this together and making us all think about this. Let me characterize the outer limits of this debate and suggest a caution. The outer limits I will characterize by what people think of as a kind of European attitude, keeping it out of this room, which is the government can do it all. I think perhaps no European thinks that, but lots of people think they do. The other possibility is also perhaps not represented here, which is we don't need governments to do any of this. The government provides law and order and national defense, and the rest will all happen. Now, bright, able, perhaps even wise people hold both views. We hear them advocated all the time. We find ourselves in this country, and what this debate's about, somewhere in the middle. Government does a lot, and we make up for its errors. We tap on the rudder to fix it because we recognize the mistakes government is capable of making, and we fill in. My cautionary note is fungibility. When we fill in for the government, it suggests it's a one-play game. What we fill in, the government may well withdraw from. Therefore, maybe we haven't done anything. What we pull back from, to go the other way, the government fills in, and therefore the debate becomes a little bit empty. I think if you think about this as a multiplay game where you have intelligent players on both sides, it may turn out that there's less here than meets the eye.
That brings up a question for this whole room and for everyone out in Webland. How many in this room, raise your hand, how many in this room feel there is, as we put it in our question, a chasm between what the government does and what the people think? How many do? Raise your hand if you feel that, in fact, what government does is not representative of what people want.
What they know and think, or
What they know and what they think. Is there a chasm between people and policymakers, is the way my colleagues more accurately phrased it? How many think so? Raise your hand. Well, for those of you who can't see, I would say there is about 60% of the room said yes, and we'll find out how many said whatever. But I'm just curious from the panel perspective, when you think about your work as a funder, is your approach to government that mainly it's not doing enough, or it's not doing something right, or is it we really want you to think differently, government?
a little of all of the above, and sometimes it's actually to reinforce government policy. But look at foster care. It's an issue we're working on. It's a big problem in this country. Everyone agrees, most people agree, that the system is terribly broken. And actually, we think that it's ripe because when we saw Hillary Clinton and Trent Lott both talking about how broken the system was, we figured there must be an opportunity here to get some forward momentum. Strange partners. At any rate, one of the two issues that we're working on in foster care, right now the federal money flows to the states based on the number of kids in foster care and how long they keep them there. So the states, in order to get the resources, want kids to stay in foster care, which we all know is exactly the wrong thing for the kids. So sometimes it's well-intentioned policy which is just totally at cross purposes with sort of serving the end user. I mean, whether there are a lot of places where the public is either poorly informed or misinformed about what the government does and doesn't do. How much money we put into foreign aid is a great example of that. Most people in this country think we put a huge amount of our resources into foreign aid, and it's actually quite small. So, again, your question is, you know, there's a disconnect in information. Sometimes there's a disconnect in policy, and there lies the opportunity for foundations to play an important role.
And the role there, Rebecca, is really one of information, good data, as opposed to taking positions, or is it both?
I think it's both, and it depends
Both.
on the issue.
And at the heart of that challenge is openness, or lack of openness. The chasm between the people and the policymakers is rooted in a lack of trust. I think that's particularly true. I think it's true at every level. But it's not limited to government. It's certainly true with nonprofits, with religious institutions, with public corporations. Information is controlled. Information is manipulated. We have a crying need for leaders from all walks of life and all sectors to embrace openness as a moral and civic virtue. And the people can have information that they can trust.
When you say manipulated, by whom?
Marketing departments, public relations specialists,
Media?
media, but I was primarily referring to the corporate and governmental manipulation of information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Comment?
I think for most foundations, and I say this after sitting for now 2 years on a panel selecting for the Council on Foundations, selecting an award for foundations in public policy, excellence in public policy, the Paul Ilvasacker Award, who is, of course, a pioneer in this area at Ford Foundation. I must say, I think reading those applications, probably 90% of them define public policy success as influencing and increasing public spending. I don't think there's any question about that. That's a kind of it lies beneath a lot of the comments that people have made about foundations and public policy today. And at Bradley, I think one of the things we were trying to do was to think about taking the available public resources and perhaps over time reducing the amount of public resources, but redirecting them in such a way that parents themselves controlled the expenditures that the state directed toward the education of their children, rather than funding an enormous educational bureaucracy, which is where a lot of the money goes. One of the things that and this does actually, I think it's implicit in a lot of what we've said here as well. This area of public policy is dominated by some huge systems. Corporations certainly, but also unions, interest groups of all kinds that have some very strong commitments, self-interested commitments to the status quo. And I think it's something that we've been hinting at here. This is not beanbag when you get into contention with these groups. If you're a foundation, if a donor or a foundation comes to this area thinking that this is the sure path to the Donor of the Year award, forget it. It isn't, and you are in fact going to see your foundation in the headlines, but not in ways you necessarily want, which is one of the reasons why I think it's very important, if you're going to do this, to have a staff and a board all entirely clear about what the vision and the purpose is, and with the hatches battened down, as it were, because it's going to be a stormy ride. But one of the things that I think foundations have to understand is that more public resources may end up simply fueling those interest groups that have a strong interest in this, a strong commitment to the status quo, rather than shaking them up.
Could I just agree? Since I've always disagreed, I completely agree that looking at growth by substitution, looking at ways the foster care system a great idea in this regard. We don't want more money. We just want it to incentivize the right activities on behalf of the states. But to your point about understanding the game and its unintended consequences, I mentioned that we have a lot of data now to show that either through a marketing term is called spillage, which is when when businesses place an ad and then there is spillage into a market they don't want. Well, the amount of spillage that's occurring in the alcohol industry now onto our youth is extraordinary. So we have launched something called the Center for Alcohol Marketing in Youth, and it has one purpose only: to stop the amount of exposure of alcohol ads to young people. Sounds like a straightforward good, right? We don't want them to quit advertising. This is not trying to interfere with the market. If you're of legal age, go at it. Well, the visit by an unnamed alcohol company to my office with 6 people basically saying I must either be naive or ignorant, but we basically ought to knock it off, and knock it off now or we would be sorry. So it gets your attention. I mean, you realize what you're up against. I'm sure everybody that's involved in policy. So policy isn't always about the government. I mean, whenever you're looking at entrenched interest, they have a position and they're not particularly happy about it. So I take both of your points.
It's interesting because you can think of that, which is a red-hot issue, and we've had work over the years with both the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the American Legacy Foundation working on the smoking issue, and you really it's really hardball. But then there are somehow there is a softer ones too. One of TPI's clients in Connecticut, the Melville Charitable Trust, is in the homelessness area, heavily focused on trying to increase state funding for supportive housing, has had some very specific wins in terms of $20, $30 million bond issues to build housing. So that's not quite as dangerous as you will, and also not the same as the Ford Foundation selling a theory of social change on human services to the government. That's very different. So we really have a huge range. Andrew?
Well, I just wanted to note that we've been talking or making a distinction or dichotomy between increasing government support for particular programs or perhaps decreasing it. But there are instances where philanthropy gets involved where government's abandoned its responsibility for particular programs. And so, for example, this year, most states in the country will actually be eliminating Medicaid recipients, low-income people, from the roles of their programs because of state budget problems. And so then the question is, how are these people going to get their care? And there is both a community support angle on that as well as a public policy angle. And so there are instances where government just steps out of a responsibility, and at times it may be important, even though there may be some substitution involved, for philanthropy to step in because no one else will.
Right. Interesting. Questions? Yes, and also questions from Webland. Is that the appropriate phrase, by the way? Webland. Is that virtual land?
Virtual land.
Virtualville.
Rob Hollister, University College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University. A question that occurs to me as I listen to the panelists is, how would this conversation be different if the topic were philanthropy and democracy? Or would it be precisely the same discussion? And the reason that I ask that is as I listen to each of the examples of your public policy work, and each of them impressive, they seem to me to vary some in their level of commitment to building sustained democratic participation. So the question I wanted to ask is, can or how can foundations advance specific public policy agendas and also build sustained democratic participation?
Great question. Thank you, Rob.
Well, I'll just jump in while others might also have a lot to add on this. A lot of our work with youth is in voter registration and getting young people, as we say, to get off the bench and into the game. And what we've learned is that the reason that they are so disconnected or feeling disenfranchised is they don't think anyone cares what they think. And they don't think that policy issues that matter to them are going to be on politicians' agendas or candidates' agendas. So part of whether it's working with Rock the Vote or MTV or some interesting partners that we didn't think we'd have 5 years ago is to give their issues voice And nothing motivates them more than having their issue get traction and feeling that they are going to matter and make a difference in the policy arena. So I would argue that everything that we're doing in the policy arena is about empowering people to exercise their right and responsibility to vote, which is the ultimate civic sort of responsibility. It is very hard, though, to get people engaged in the abstract, to talk about them being better citizens, more engaged in their democracy. My guess is that most of your convening is around issues that are really important in your community. And it is the issue that brings them there, and it is the issue that starts them talking, and then they start to understand the power that is present in that room that can be applied for the community good. But it would be hard probably to get them there to say we're going to come together to talk about democracy in our community. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think one way to foster this process is to demonstrate success. Leaders like to accomplish things when they're in office. They like to see projects go up. They like to see programs implemented. They don't particularly enjoy the controversy in the council room when it's filled with adversarial tension. They, when they see that a democratic process can be effective and complement their aims, they're quick to jump on board. The difficulty is understanding the difference in what we're talking about than selling their program. You know, we've had elected officials come to us and other community leaders and say, I have this great program, this great project. I want you all to help us sell the community on it. Well, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're all about. And that's not the democratic process as we promote it through the Jeffersonian notion. Jefferson said that in response to those who felt the public was not enlightened enough to exercise their discretion, he said the answer is not to move the system of power away from them, but to educate them. That institutions and leaders have a responsibility to educate the public. But to do that, they need good information, and they need reliable information. And in this culture of secrecy and control of information, that's really at the heart.
I just want us to remember that there are other aspects to democracy and other ways for foundations to encourage those other aspects of democracy. I think every day in the neighborhoods of America, folks are stepping forward to tackle their own problem. I know I sound like a broken record, but every day there are people out there stepping forward to solve their own problem. That is citizenship. It's not voting, which is something you do every 2 years or 4 years. It's in fact active agency in tackling problems in your own backyard. Those folks are by and large operating invisibly. I mean, they are invisible to the larger structures of society. They're invisible to government. They're invisible to corporations. They're invisible to the United Way, oftentimes, and they're invisible to foundations. I don't think people in the neighborhoods have the sense that foundations are accessible to them any more than government. I think that's a very, very serious problem for precisely the reason that Rebecca Reimel defined earlier. Of all the groups that have just absolute freedom to do almost anything they want, it's foundations. I mean, we don't have to be. You don't have to. It's not taxpayer dollars. You don't have to dole it out in a certain way so that everyone is assured of equity. You don't have to avoid faith-based groups. It's interesting that one of the misimpressions that many foundations have is that they like the state cannot get involved with the church. I mean, it's an amazing misunderstanding, but it's true. And Pew has done a terrific job, incidentally, of clarifying and advancing that whole the notion that faith-based institutions have a legitimate role to play in American society.
Right.
But
it's interesting because this notion of the invisible networks, there's a foundation in Boston that is now really trying to dig deep into the neighborhoods to look at those networks. And I think it goes to Rob's question. Other questions?
Grassroots initiatives. I am the founder of a program called Street Peace, and figured out in some ways how to get the media to help.
A little louder, Rob.
Oh, can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
A little louder. No, that's not on.
Okay.
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. And so around the invisibility, it's been a very big struggle to figure out how to continue to meet the needs in my community and find the funding to continue to do the work, especially after the first 2 years. I'm a 2-year-old program, so now the honeymoon's over, and it's time to really figure out how to continue to meet this need in the community. Needless to say, our program does, try to stop the violence, and dealing with gun shootings and so forth. I don't know how to, and I don't know whether policy should be in place for this. I don't know how to actually get past the unpopularity. If what you're doing, for whatever reason, becomes an unpopular or not the, I guess one would use the sexy funding opportunity in some cases, then whether the need is still there or not, it tends to be moved away from. And then I know so many founders of programs who have just gotten frustrated and went on to do something else. Maybe they're working for UPS now or something. And I refuse, after 12 years of doing gang peace and then turning around to do street peace, to just leave this issue alone. But I certainly am not a genius at figuring out how to navigate the philanthropic community. And so I said, well, let me get with people who are, and maybe they can understand what need we're trying to, fix here.
That's good, Rob.
So
It
how do
is
you?
a terrible issue and a strain. Another question in front there?
My name's Chris Fox. I'm with a Massachusetts-based organization called Mass Inc. We do public policy research and advocacy. And Peter, with your permission, I'd broaden this question to answer one of the items on your list, which is, what are the strategies that work? And I'll offer an observation. I would look to the incentive structure that exists in the system. In my crude way of saying it, I'd say, try to answer the question, what's in it for me? And, there are many public policy actors, the judiciary, the legislature, the executive branch, to name a few. I'll pick the legislature. I don't want to make it one-dimensional, but there is a preeminent interest that they have, and that is to get reelected. And to get reelected, they have to accumulate a majority, and that means assembling constituencies. And to assemble constituencies, they have to address the same question, what's in it for them? And so in order to succeed, I think the legislature is looking to you and other advocates to try to relate your issue to their constituents. In other words, they will ask the question, where's the face of my constituents in your issue? And if you do make that, if you do draw that line, you'll get the attention of that policy, public policy actor.
Comment on that question of how to align the efforts of advocacy with the self-interest or other interest of government? We have even a question here of how to align your grant making with public policy.
I just say it's key if
Key.
you want to win.
Another question up here.
Thanks. I'm Meg Gage, president of the Proteus Fund. If one of the goals of philanthropy related to public policy is to not get too far ahead of the public and try to reduce that chasm, which I think it is, so that involves educating people and making sure that you're bringing people along and that people understand the policies that you're advocating. It's interesting to me that we haven't discussed yet what level the policy is focused. And we've do most of our grant making related to state level policy because people understand it better and they relate to their legislators. It's easier for them to get to their state capital within the context of devolution, increasingly important decisions that affect people's lives, at least domestic issues, happen in state capitals. So for me, part of the question about philanthropy is where is the policy made? And I was especially interested in the Kentucky example. But it's very hard for philanthropists to fund at the state level unless it's just one state, because there are 50 states. But it's in those many different, we think of them as laboratories of democracy, that lots of different policies are tried, healthcare, campaign finance reform, and tried out. And we see what works and what doesn't, school reform, for example. So for me, another way of looking at this chasm question is to look at where the policy, what level. I mean, even municipal policy is an area, if engaging people and bringing them along is part of the goal. And this kind of using policy work to invigorate democracy, which so often we do the opposite. It's like, well, we'll pass this policy and then we'll worry about people figuring it out. And because policies now are so complicated, healthcare, school reform and so on, they really do take, it's hard for people to, it's hard not to have a chasm.
That leads really beautifully into a large question that we have for the panel in terms of what really are the lessons learned here and what are the strategies that have worked, what have been tipping points, to use a phrase. And I think to some degree we've heard about some of the pitfalls and limitations and what the bottom line is, the do's and don'ts and the unintended consequences. But as you think for a few minutes, panel, about what have you learned as you've tried to do this, how would you frame that?
Well, could I start and play off the last question? Because I believe if you're interested in changing national policy, a really great place to start is the states.
Is the state?
Is a state or states. We started something called stateline.org, which is an organization that's available to State House reporters so they can learn what's going on around the country in other states. But let me use just a quick example. One of our priority areas is universal access to pre-K education for every 3- and 4-year-old in this country. We believe that the data is compelling, that if you get kids into age-appropriate education at the age of 3, they do better in the long run. Well, that's not going to happen with federal policy. So what we're doing is basically picking off the 10 states that we think are ripest for this in the country. And if, as 10 states go, so will the nation. I mean, because at the point you get 10 states that mandate, legislate pre-K education for all 3- and 4-year-olds, and there are already now 4. So our strategy is very state-based in that regard. We ultimately have sort of a national policy agenda, but the intervention point is at the states, and that's where the innovation is going to happen, and that's where the people, the constituents, are going to get out and tell their state legislators, we want this. I mean, they tried to take it away in New York recently. Turned out that the police were our biggest advocates in fighting against that. And in Georgia, once they passed it, in Florida, now it's there to stay. So I think you're really on to something, which is one of the sort of lessons that we needed to learn is understand what your end game is, and then be wildly open to the tools that you can employ to get there. There's not one right way. And I think speaking of being insular, I think we all too often think that there is one right way, which maybe speaks to your top-down approach.
Panel on this question?
Well, I think I've touched on our lessons learned to a great extent already. I might reinforce 3 points. I guess the one point that we've learned in our work is that how important it is, how valuable it is to really treasure, really value the voice of all people from all walks of life. The people know when you're doing that. Communities understand when their stories are being heard. When you take programs to the neighborhoods, to the community centers, to the schools and the churches, when you take time to listen, you just elevate the whole level of participation and credibility to another level. 2, the value and importance of deliberation. Too many advocacy groups jump from information to action. They don't want to take time to hear the other point of view. They don't want to take time to engage in deliberation. they have information from their point of view, from their perspective, and they're ready to promote it. I think we would all be better off if more groups and more processes would include that dimension of deliberation. I think we would come out of it with a stronger coalition for action, a stronger sense of common ground. And then, of course, the last dimension of that is information. The requisite for information is openness, which I've been preaching about all along. So.
Well said. Beautiful.
A couple thoughts. We've been focused for most of this 2 hours on public policy and speaking about public policy from a kind of advocacy, influencing government perspective. And in doing so, I think we've left out the kind of more traditional role of philanthropies as grant makers in communities. And in some ways, Bill started us by talking about a particular example in Milwaukee. And I think the point that Chris from Mass Inc. made is that I think the tipping point often comes when you can demonstrate in a local community or from a national perspective in a state something that really works. And that there is a lot of noise in the public policy space and a lot of noise from advocacy organizations, much of which is, I think, important and positive. But it's hard for decision makers to sort it out. But when they see something that works, and I think often it requires taking a risk to start a program sometimes that works, like the program this gentleman referred to in terms of street violence or others. We're investing in 3 programs in 3 communities in Massachusetts where volunteer physicians are filling a role traditionally performed by community clinics that simply don't exist in these communities. And it may be that from the work of voluntary physicians we can learn a lot and create some models that will allow us to provide care for people without insurance. I think similarly, back to the question about democracy, this may seem like a leap, but I think philanthropies, again, often can help people without a voice. And right now, people without a voice in the healthcare environment tend to be immigrants. And they're new to our nation, and often they're not participating in the democratic process because they can't even participate in the basic kind of civic parts of life. And so we've made immigrant health and trying to make our healthcare system more responsive and competent to people's linguistic and cultural heritage very important. And again, I think that's something that policymakers tend to stay away from. There are a lot of reasons, political and otherwise, why government will back away from new citizens, and I think that's an area where philanthropies can really step in.
Great examples and a great caution against too much rhetoric. Have any of you noticed there's a lot of rhetoric out there? I don't know. Maybe I'm alone. Bill?
I would say that the tipping point is the point at which the program continues even if the foundation behind it or supporting it right along disappeared. And that speaks to a larger issue, which is, and I think that there's a kind of a misimpression here that if you get the techniques right or the process right, or if you just use the Pew method or the Bradley method, that you'll succeed, and if you don't succeed, you just need to tune the instruments a little bit. I think a donor has to think long and hard about how his or her project relates to the larger American political order and how it fits into a larger and relatively successful constitutional system that has a lot of the characteristics we've been talking about. It is, in fact, a system of limited government. It is, in fact, a system of dispersed federal, state, local government. It is a system that relies on, the market to a large degree. And if you're going to be successful in this realm of public policy making, you really have to have a very clear understanding of what you're trying to undertake fits into that larger framework. You have to be able to see that and explain that. It is not the case that any idea can be promoted successfully in the American political order using the right techniques. I think that's very important. I think that a single-payer healthcare system, to pluck an example out of the air, would be a tough sell in America. No matter how many millions of dollars foundations put into this, and Lord knows they are putting something on that order into those kinds of causes. They won't have any success because at the end of the day, it runs athwart the basic political beliefs of the system that are in the hearts of the American people. They're there in the hearts of the citizens, and it's not going to go away. And the other, just a quick piece of advice, and this is especially for small donors who by now must be saying, wow, this is just really way too complicated. Finding the Mrs. Cordelia Taylors is in fact an act of public policy. I hope that's very clear. Again, Mrs. Taylor is a vital part of American civil society. She is a citizen stepping forward to tackle a problem, and a small donor in particular could do considerably worse than to support Mrs. Taylor. Because by so doing, you're not just helping Mrs. Taylor tackle the problems of 11th Street. You are, in fact, sustaining American civil society. You are, in fact, sustaining the principle that neighbors and communities can step forward and tackle their own problems. That is a critical American principle. And I think that insofar as you achieve success and arrive at a tipping point in public policy, it's when you tap into some kind of a basic American principle like that, and the people themselves, as I'm sure Rodney's discovered, the people themselves taps into their fundamental values, and they take ownership.
I mean, that's really well done, I think, Bill, and builds on Rob Hollister's issue around democracy and on Chris Fox's comment of not only aligning yourself with the self-interests of legislators, but aligning yourself with the fundamental self-interest. We had Leslie Pine, my colleague, and I were with a new client who asked an interesting question, or raised an interesting postulate. He said, I want to go to government and ask them what they can't do, that we could help them do, that's important to do. How's that sound, panel? Ever do that?
Well, you could do that, although I make a related point. I think we've left one important player out of this conversation thus far, and it's really the business community of corporate America. It's certainly important in healthcare. I agree with Bill's political analysis of single payer, and so then if you're interested in the issue of how we're going to advance universal coverage, you probably have to accept the fact that we have an employer-based system and we need to build on that. And so as we've talked about public policy, we've tended to talk about it as interest groups out here facing off or influencing government over here. But there is a major, another player who's involved in American life and American civic life and American public policy, and that's the business community. And so we at our foundation view the business community in corporate America as an audience, as a constituent, as a group that we want to partner with in various ways. And so I think it's important, again, not to define public policy or the work we do in public policy too narrowly. Of course, there are instances where you may be paid a visit that's not so pleasant from the business community, but I think in general the business community wants to work on these issues, certainly in healthcare and education. They've demonstrated that again and again. And so I think to pose to yourself as a philanthropist, how can you engage the business community as a partner in a positive way, not necessarily as a funder, but really as a partner in thinking about public policy issues and thinking about solutions to these complex problems, you'll be well served by that.
That's different, Rebecca, than the CEO who came into your office from
Well,
an unnamed company.
I agree. And let me say that on both scores, first of all, to pick an issue that, as we said, is ripe, an issue where public sentiment and public opinion is, the wind is at your back. Pick an issue where what you bring to the table is going to add value. Spend the time, do the due diligence that will take much longer than you would like, a year or two, to understand the field in which you're working. Hire people with expertise. And yes, business partners, they've been critically helpful to us on campaign finance reform and on a range of other issues. To the question of your new donor, we do have to remember, and somebody else said it much more eloquently, when you boil it all down in the scope of these kinds of things, we're a rounding error in terms of the amount of money that we have to bring to the table if you really look at it that way. So we have to look for leverage I'd use the example of we fund young scientists, and one of the things when you talk to them, biomedical scientists, they say that the way government funding works discourages risk-taking. You know, you have to sort of have done the experiment before. So we designed our program to say, here is an insurance policy for risk-taking. You already get money from the government. We want you to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do with your government support to expand your scientific inquiry. And interestingly, the idea came to me from one of our board members out of the private sector, a CEO, corporate CEO, who said, you know, the best work in my corporation happened offline, not the work that we were paying for. So it was really his idea to sort of leverage off of the government support. But I certainly agree with what both my colleagues have said about cautions.
I'd like to turn a little bit as we come down to the end of our time together. One of the questions that came in from virtual land was around what is the role of the infrastructure of organized philanthropy, like regional associations of grant makers, the Council on Foundation, the emerging networks, the community foundations. What is their role in encouraging or educating around public policy issues? Any comment from the panel?
Well, I'd say at a local or statewide level, actual alliances between funders can be a very powerful tool in promoting change and promoting public policy. And so, for example, in Massachusetts, one of my first acts was to seek out a group of health funders, and only to find out that there was no formal structure, and so we created one. And this is now the Massachusetts Health Funders Network, and allows it, and particularly some foundations that might be less willing to take risks on public policy will do so in alliance with other funders. So I think, at least I can only speak from a statewide level, that I think that can be a very positive role.
I would just to slip in a different point of view. I would say that the role of the organizations, the mainstream organizations in philanthropy, is primarily to enforce the orthodoxy, the accepted ways of doing business, and that a donor would be well advised to certainly to check in and see what's going on, see what they're up to, but then to strike out on their own, because I don't think there's a lot of imagination coming out of the established associations in philanthropy today, with the exception, of course, of the Philanthropy Roundtable.
A question also from a foundation executive, Ben Binswanger, who asks from virtual land, everyone seeds programs. Who should sustain them? It seems like government, foundations, and business, they seed, but how do you sustain? And I think when you think of these the world of advocacy and public policy in particular, do you have to be a long distance runner here?
Well, you have to be able to answer that question before you start. And you should. That's true whether you're trying to change policy or getting involved in a direct service delivery program. I mean, I think one of the shame on us is if you're going to get involved in direct service delivery, I mean, it's a 20, 30, 50-year ride. And, you know, we do that in our local community. We have a fund that provides frontline service providers money every year to do what they do for the most needy in our community. And it'll be there long after I'm gone. But if you're involved in the policy game, that is exactly the question, to change the policy so that there's a dedicated funding stream to make sure that the policy is both enacted and has longevity. So you have to be able to answer the question before you start.
That's great. All right, one sentence from each of our panelists as what you think the takeaway has been for you. Rodney?
Well, I've learned a great deal. I came here to listen and learn as much as anything. I hope I've been able to contribute a bit from the perspective of a small community and a foundation that's crafted its role and mission, I think, uniquely and effectively.
One sentence.
I guess there's a place for public policy initiatives within the framework of any foundation.
Thank you.
Humbled by the task, buoyed by the opportunity. And I think understanding we all have privileged positions and we ought to use that privilege to serve the citizens of this country.
Thank you.
Continue to take risks, because I think that is one of the key ways that foundations create value.
Thank you.
Remember that you always operate in the context of civil society with millions of invisible groups trying to do the best they can, and they deserve support as part of an understanding of public policy.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, participants. Thank you, Putnam Investments. Thank you, WGBH Forum. Thank you, John Aberle.